Hey guys, welcome back. I now have my coffee and my water. If you noticed at the end of the last video, I started to lose some steam towards the end. So this one, I decided to be armed with coffee and water to get me through. I am so excited to be here again with you. This is our third video for the Inductive Bible Study series of the Book of John with Love and Unity Ministries. I am your host, your guide through the workbook. Yes, the workbook. Please, if you haven't had a chance to email me yet about the workbook, please do so. I need more coffee. And I will get that workbook to you so that you can understand what it is that I'm looking at as I'm looking at my computer here, so you can be looking at the same thing instead of looking at me looking at my computer. You can be pouring yourself over your workbook, taking up every single thing that it has to offer. Today we're going to be going over consideration before interpretation. It's my way of saying context. Let's talk about the context of the book of John. Let's talk about what was going on when it was written. Let's talk about some of the customs that might be explained or not explained in the book, some of the things we can understand from the book, some of the things we understand around the book that we need to then apply to the book as we're looking at it. Long and short of it is that this book was written about 2,000 years ago, and we need to take into consideration some things that may have been happening 2,000 years ago, some things that have changed in 2,000 years before we go ahead and try to apply these concepts to our lives. So open up to your workbook, please, and the title is Consideration Before Interpretation. Before we get into the text of John, there are some items for consideration. Observing evidence before understanding what items might be significant can cause to misunderstand the message. So if we find a piece of evidence, but we indirectly apply that piece of evidence to the story, we may end up with a skewed interpretation. So if we don't understand what evidence we're looking at, we may either miss the evidence altogether, or we may misapply that evidence. So having some idea of the context of what the evidence might be is important. The text of the Bible is ancient. It's not aged. It's not old. It's not very old. It's ancient. Thus, the cultural context of John is very, very different than the culture of 2023 in the United States, where I'm filming this right now. Perspectives are different, and ignoring the difference will lead to irresponsibly reading, then observing, then interpreting the text. So ignoring the perspectives and what those might be is irresponsible to collecting the evidence, to reading, to observing the evidence, to looking at it, to interpreting the text, to interpreting what that evidence might mean. Completely irresponsible if we don't understand the original perspective, or at least have some idea of the original perspective. Another factor to consider is that these are theological texts and they have significant divine depth. What do you mean by that? I mean that this isn't just a text. This isn't a textbook. This isn't a science class you're taking. This isn't black and white. This isn't how to build a table. This is the Word of God delivered by the Holy Spirit to men to communicate from God to His creation. God is big. God is really, really big. God has really, really been around forever, will be around forever. He's huge. He has a lot to communicate. He used the Bible to communicate to us. That's a limited, finite source of text. I'm willing to bet that he built a whole lot into that text. If we're talking about a gigantic God in one book of the Bible that has many books within it, there's probably a lot packed into every single word, as we'll find out together. That's divine depth. For hundreds of years, these texts have been studied and questioned, always leading to further understanding. While our Maker used man to craft the text, he most certainly added his very own spirit to the text, allowing it to come alive and remain alive for those who wish to explore it. How beautiful. Make no mistake. Warning. Make no mistake. There will be divine meaning layered in each message. It may challenge not just your mind. It may be hard to understand. So there will be divine meaning layered in each message that will likely be hard to understand. But it will also change the way that you view yourself, the world around you, and transform your relationship with the Word. So just be prepared to be a little changed, to be a little uneasy, to be a little uncomfortable, to be a little unsure. That's all okay. Be open to it and be prayerful. As we mentioned in the previous video, we always pray before we start this process. So hopefully you prayed before you started this video. I did. I hope you did. Anyway, you get the point. So let's get back into context. Authorship. So we kind of always want to know who wrote the book, right? Well, we don't get to know that with most of the historical books of the Bible. We don't get to know that beyond any doubt whatsoever. We have a lot of great assumptions based on a lot of great evidence, but a lot of it is not 100% conclusive. There are some questions about things. So why are you bringing this up, Maureen? If we don't have an answer to it, why are you bringing it up? Well, because it's important to know. It's important to know because we want to know what the mindset was, what the culture was, what the background was of the person who was writing the book. Just like when you tell a story, you have a different version of that story than somebody who may have been standing right next to you. Why is that? Because you have a different worldview than that person next to you might have. That's why it's important to understand who the historical author may have been. All that being said, I'm leaving the script from the workbook, so I'm sorry if you're following along. I'll get back to it right now. In the workbook under authorship, we have historical author versus implied author. The historical author of John, ready, is unknown, but there are speculations. John the Elder, John Zebedee, and Lazarus. Yes, I said Lazarus. Yes, the guy that Jesus brought back from the dead. There's no hard evidence to support any one of those three as the actual historical author. More than likely, there was more than one person who penned the scriptures, probably with an editor who put it all together. So just so you know, you don't have to assume that one person wrote the book of John. In fact, you'd be wrong to assume that. In most cases, the authors of the books of the Bible are anonymous. Many of the books have multiple authors along with editors. Generally, the editor is the one that gets to put their name on the book. So the editor of the book of John, likely his name was John. In most cases, the authors of the books of the Bible are anonymous, meaning that historical biographies, which is what this is, a historical biography, they didn't have a byline. It didn't say on the title of the papyrus, it didn't say Book of John, written by John. It didn't say that. It was papyrus. The space was precious. They weren't worried about the bylines. They were worried about the content. What they were writing on the papyrus was more important than who wrote on the papyrus. It's important to note, though, do not discredit that in the 27 books of the New Testament, material can all be traced back to eyewitnesses or contact with people who are eyewitnesses. Well, I would certainly hope so, Maureen. Well, yeah, I would certainly hope so. However, what makes that unique and different and worth mentioning is that during the time period that this was written about, okay, so not just when this was written, but the time period that this was written about were very close together for this material, meaning that when the events of Jesus' life happened, eyewitnesses or people who were in contact with eyewitnesses helped craft this material. Other material written about the same time period were written centuries sometimes after the actual event. So we're talking about a very short period of time between, if any time at all, between Jesus walking the earth and these events being recorded. That cannot be said for very many other documents of its time. Very important, distinguished. Okay, so that's what we know about the historical author, which is we don't know a whole heck of a lot. We know that he was either an eyewitness or had contact with an eyewitness. We know that there was probably more than one author, and we know that we don't know for sure who that author is, and that we're pretty sure that the editor may have been a guy named John. If you'd like some of my information on my resources for this information, because I'm blowing your mind and I'm kind of irritating you because I'm making you question things, get with me and I'll send you some of the textbooks that I have from school that show these facts. The implied author is different than the historical author. So you have all of this ambiguity and confusion and grayness of the historical author. That's okay. For our purposes in inductive Bible study, that is A-okay. The implied author is who we're going to be working with, which is what your next blank is. The implied author is the only author, actually, that we can work with. Even if we could identify the author, we couldn't question him or hymns or her or whomever because they're dead. Thus, we rely on questioning the implied author. So what do you mean by that? So what do we do is the next bullet point. We focus on the text rather than authorship or the author. We cannot question who wrote this material, but we can question the material because we're going to have questions. We're not going to understand all of it. To gain a better understanding of what's going on, we need to circle back to the text if we have a question and see if that answer is somewhere else in the text. Next, we'll talk about audience. Audience, like authorship, is important to understand to help you have a better understanding of who this material was meant to be written for during that time, okay? So in my last video, I talked about how the Bible was written for everybody. The Bible was written for all of us right now in 2023, back in 1980, all the way back to, year 10. It's all written for the purposes of right now, whatever that right now is. However, the time that it was written in and the author and the audience that it was originally written to matters because of the evidence. Because remember earlier what I said about the evidence is that if we misunderstand the evidence, we're going to misunderstand the principle that's trying to be the evidence that the author is trying to get across to the audience. We're going to misunderstand that evidence and apply it incorrectly. So we want to take a look at the audience. Who is the book of John written for? The book of John was written for, back to the workbook. I'm just getting all over the place today. Based on the evidence in the text, we gather who it wasn't written to rather than who it was written to. What? Yeah. So we don't know who it was specifically written to. Again, the historical author we're unsure of. We're not sure who the author was, so we can't ask that author. The text isn't specific saying to the people of Corinth, for example, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians. This text just says Book of John. Well, what can we do? We can ask questions of the text, the implied author, and we can try to understand some information from that. So what we can find is that there are multiple explanations. There's explanation of Hebrew and explanation of Aramaic words. So we know that more than likely the audience that this was written to did not understand Hebrew and did not understand Aramaic. We also find multiple explanations of Jewish and Samaritan customs, meaning that more than likely the people who this book was written to were not of Jewish background or Samaritan background. So who does that leave? Everybody else, right? Me and you. Perfect. So we'll have a good understanding of Hebrew, Aramaic, Jewish, and Samaritan customs by the time we're done with this, or at least as much as the editor and the implied author of John wanted us to have. Next, we'll go over historical context. Again, as I mentioned earlier, this is an ancient biography. It's not old, it's not very old, it's not a couple decades outdated. It is ancient biography. They played by different rules when they wrote biographies in ancient times. They were not concerned with timelines, they were very concerned with character. The text was arranged to prove who Jesus was rather than the exact details of his life, and they marry history with theology. What do I mean by all that? I mean that the author or authors, we'll just stick with the implied author. The implied author isn't concerned with the chronological order of the events. He's not concerned with Jesus's birth. He's not concerned so much with his childhood. He's concerned with where the story starts and where the story ends according to Jesus's character as this author sees it. The points that the author wants to drive home here speak to Jesus's character, not the details and the scientific dates and times of his life. We're not used to that these days. We're used to knowing exactly when things happen. Things are time-stamped. You can look something up. There's always a paper trail. That's not the case. So we have to let that stuff go and try to understand what is it that we're looking at. We're looking at an ancient biography held by different standards with a different purpose. We also know, based on the text, the historical content, that Jesus was Jewish. We know that he went to synagogue, and we know that he went to work. We know that he was not poor and that he could read and write. We also know that ancient people believed that how you were born and how you died revealed your character. So if we take a look at Jesus being Jewish, we know that he's Jewish because he went to synagogue, and we know that he went to work, so we know he couldn't have been poor. We know that he could read and write because there's scripture, specifically actually in the book of John, where it talks about him drawing in the sand. So if he's drawing in the sand, he probably knows how to write. And if he was reading scriptures to teach, he knows how to read. Ancient people believe that how you were born and how you died revealed your character. How Jesus was born is very specific in other gospels. This gospel doesn't have it as much, but this gospel does talk about where Jesus came from. So not so much where he was born, but where he came from mattered. And when you read the first chapter of John, you'll see that Jesus came from God. And how Jesus died is a complete contrast to that. Jesus was killed via crucifixion, one of the most shameful ways to die during that time. So Jesus came from God himself and then died in a very shameful manner. What does that say about Jesus? That's what this author is trying to get across to us as the readers, that in that time, the way you were born, the way you came into this world, and the way you went out of this world spoke to your character. So what is the author trying to imply about Jesus' character? We'll read the book of John together to figure that out. But just know that that matters. Okay, miracles. Miracles. We had a great discussion in class last Wednesday about this when I did the live tape. We talked about miracles, and we talked about how we don't get to leave our mind out of the equation, nor do we leave our faith out of the equation. One of the people in class gave the example of being in a blizzard as a young child, and he remembers that his parents drove on an empty tank of gas for the majority of the day until they got about a quarter of a mile from their house and then ran out of gas. Luckily, they were only a quarter of a mile away and could walk home to the warm. But they were in fact in a blizzard for an entire day on an empty tank of gas. Now, I noticed some people, because of my position in the room, their facial expression changed a bit. Like, come on, yeah, right. An empty tank of gas, are you sure you're remembering that correctly? We know you're not lying, but are you sure that you're remembering that correctly? And that's where we can't leave our mind out of the equation, because in order for something to be a miracle, it has to defy the laws that we've put on nature. It has to defy the truths that we accept as truths. A miracle is something that happens that can't be explained or can't happen. It's a miracle. It's an act of God. We also don't get to leave our faith out of the equation, because we have to have some faith that this man was telling the truth, that this man did tell the truth accurately as he remembers from the story. So you need your faith to believe that laws were defied, thus you get a miracle. There's a lot of miracles discussed in the book of John, so I just wanted to make sure that I highlighted that in a miracle situation, you have to use your mind and you also have to use your faith. During the time that Jesus came into the world, we also had political power plays all over the place. They do a really good job of showing this in the series The Chosen from Angel Studios. It's not a plug for them. I'm just saying that I think that they do a fantastic job of showing all the different people groups and how everybody was trying to be in control of everything all the time, which is kind of exactly what was happening. So the intertestamental, the time in between the testaments was about 500 years. So you have the Old Testament of the Bible, then you have the New Testament of the Bible. The Old Testament covered a certain time period, the New Testament covers a different time period. In between that, there's nothing written. For about 500 years, there's no documents that are added to the Bible. The canon or the books of the Bible, nothing gets added to that in that 500-year period. Well, but things happened, right? Because there's a stark difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Obviously, Jesus is one of the differences. But what was he walking into? He wasn't walking into what was going on at the Old Testament. He walked into something different. One of the things, the major thing that was different, is that a Hellenistic culture had been adopted. So after Alexander the Great came in, there was a Maccabean revolt and there was confusion everywhere. The Jews, I missed a bullet point. So the Hellenistic culture had been adopted, which means that when Alexander the Great came in, he enforced the Greek language to be used. So all of the different languages got set to the side, and Greek had to be the one to be used for all of the public communication purposes. So everything changed to Greek. The next bullet point is the Old Testament actually was rewritten in Greek, and it's called the Septuagint, or the LXX. LXX stands for 70 because it's believed that 70 people worked together to translate the Old Testament from Hebrew to Greek. Why is that significant? That's significant. Why am I telling you that? Because it's important to understand what it is that we're looking at. It's important to understand what it is they were looking at when they wrote these things. So the people who wrote the pages of the New Testament weren't looking at, most likely, weren't looking at the Hebrew version of the Old Testament. They were looking at the Greek version of the Old Testament. I'm not saying it's inaccurate. I'm saying, though, that you're working with a translation already. You're working from the Hebrew translation to the Greek translation, which is different than looking at directly the Hebrew translation. If you'd like, you can go back to my first video where I talked about Bible translations to better understand what I mean by all of that. Or you can shoot me an email and I can answer it for you. But it is significant that the Hellenistic culture had filtered into the pages of ancient Holy Scripture. As I think I've alluded to or said directly, the Jews were not free. They were under Roman rule. So the Jews were not free to live the way that they had always lived. They weren't always free. You can find that out if you read the pages of the Old Testament. Some really incredible stories in the Old Testament about the Jews being in captivity. Anyway, I digress. What is concerning about the Jews not being free? Well, to us and to them, what stands out there is that the Jews had major concerns about cleanliness. They had a lot of laws that were given to them, handed down to them from God about how to be clean, how to be properly clean to be operating in social circles. So there were tons and tons of laws on what you could touch, what you could eat, who you could see, who you could talk to, all the kinds of things that would make you clean or unclean. And treatment of the land also mattered because the land was very important to the Jewish people. How the land was treated was also in a clean or unclean manner. So if the temple was unclean, that was a big problem because that's where God lived. So they had a constant threat to their way of life because they have all of this foreign domination making everything unclean all the time. Their way of life is now way more cumbersome than it was before because they have to go through all of these extra steps just to live the life that they feel that God has asked them to live. So they have the Roman laws that are now being enforced on top of the God laws that they are being true, they're trying to be true to. So you can see how difficult it would be to be a Jewish person when in the physical realm, as a physical person, I have a Roman soldier standing right here telling me to do something, and it's directly going against what I feel God is telling me to do. What am I going to do? As a breathing, living human being, what am I going to do? I'm probably going to submit to the Romans' laws because that's what's going to keep me alive and keep me providing for my family. You can see why this was a difficult decision for a lot of the Jewish people. And time and again, those people would be aggravated enough to revolt. And there would be the zealots who would rise up from time to time to protest taxes. It was difficult, it was stressful, and when you have enough, and they'd rise up and the Romans would shut them down. And then they'd rise up again, and the Romans would shut them down even further, coming down harder and harder and harder on the Jewish people. As much as the Jewish people wanted to be free, every time they rose up, Rome came down harder, and tensions started to build as the Jews became more and more uncomfortable in their own land. And the forces, the powers, the physical powers that be, came down harder and harder on a way of life that they just wanted to be honest and true to God. So therefore, religious activity was always political activity. which is a completely foreign idea to us, that political activity is religious activity. But in some countries today, that's still true. But let me explain it to you this way, that I used this example in class the other night, that if you were living right next door, so say this is like Jew and Roman, okay? And you have the Jewish people that say it's part of the law that they go to bed at 10 o'clock and they wake up at 6 o'clock, and then they go into the field and they do the work that they need to do. They're living right next door to a Roman soldier. Say that part of the Roman soldier's religion was playing loud music at 3 a.m. That Jewish person might be pretty irritated, pretty upset, pretty done by the third night in a row of this guy listening to his music at 3 a.m. That's going to cause a problem. That's going to cause unrest. That's going to cause argument. That's going to cause issues. Now, the person who's losing their sleep and not being able to go to work isn't able to pay taxes because they can't go out and work in the field and harvest their crops to get the money to pay the taxes. You can see why this is an issue, because they can't get the Roman guy to stop playing the music because Rome is in control. So you can see how many layers there are to the unrest and the frustration that all of the people groups were feeling at the time. This is what Jesus walked into. Also, what's really important to understand, and what is vastly different than our culture today, is that the next bullet point says honor and shame culture. So making decisions based on preserving honor and avoiding shame at all costs. We had a great discussion again about this point in class on Wednesday when we talked about how we make decisions today versus how people back then made decisions. Back then you made a decision about honor and shame. When I make this decision, is it going to bring my family honor? Then yes, I'm going to do it. Is it going to bring my family shame? Then no, I want nothing to do with it because I'm avoiding shame at all costs. So if my son does something that's unclean, if my son does something that is shameful to the family, am I going to include him back in the family? No, because my decision is based on honor. It's not based on loyalty. It's not based on those kinds of things, that honesty and truth today that we hold, or that we are asked to hold as how we make our decisions. It's based on honor, based on shame. Will this bring my family honor, or will it bring my family shame? If it brings my family shame, it's got to go. There is a hierarchical nature of society that led to relationships based on reciprocity and patronage. What does that mean? It means that it was the pyramid of society led and was built on the reciprocity and patronage. So you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. And the higher you got to the top, the more back scratching, the more people that you had to have feeding into your way of life, the more you had to have that, the higher to the top you got. So you very much, everything socially was dependent on, I'll do this for you, you do that for me. If I don't do this for you after you've done something for me, that is shameful and I'm out of the equation. See how important this all is? And it's also to be noted that, believe it or not, money had very little significance in day-to-day life for the average Jew. The property and goods were the measuring sticks of your livelihood. So the only reason that Jews primarily dealt with money was because they had to pay taxes. What mattered in the Jewish culture was the land and the property and the goods. It was more of a bartering society for the Jewish people than it was monetarily driven. So it wasn't how much is that dress, it's what can I do for you to make me that dress. So there's investment, there's personal investment with every transaction. It's not cold hard cash. Then of course, a lot of us are familiar with the patriarchy. Patriarchy is a male-dominated society. Males are head of the household, males. Females were not given very much attention, if any. No evidence of Jewish priestesses, no Jewish teachers had female followers, which, as we all know, Jesus was very different in this way. Jesus had female followers. Jesus did have women that became priestesses after him, after he came. Thank you, Jesus. Next, which kind of culminates it all together, is that It was identity formed by fitting in with the crowd rather than standing out from the crowd. One of my professors says that being a Jew in this time was like being an awkward teenager today. Like, God forbid they don't fit in. Really and truly, God forbid they don't fit in. God wanted unity. God wanted diversity. God wanted people to be able to be expressive of themselves and everybody contribute to the equation, but he doesn't want somebody completely swimming in the other direction. That's not what the Jews believed he was after. The Jews believed that he was after everybody fitting in together, everybody working together, everybody contributing together, and everybody falling in line for order instead of chaos. Remember, everything else in their life was chaotic. Everything outside of their family, and sometimes even in their family, but for the most part, everything outside of their family was pure chaos. They were looking for conformity. They were looking for predictability. They were looking for comfort. And ancient Jews like me today, I love to be comfortable. I don't like to be uncomfortable. I don't like unease. I don't like unrest. I want to be predictable. I want to know when things are going to happen so I can feel a sense of safety and security. I don't blame them for wanting the same thing. Their identity was also formed on where they were born, which is why you hear a lot of the times Jesus of Nazareth, that people were from a certain space, people were from a certain territory. And then what also mattered was who their father was. So you may say John the sons of Zebedee. So Zebedee's sons, John and Andrew, I think. Get me in the comments on that one if you know who the other Zebedee is. And then what gender, obviously, patriarchal society, the gender mattered very much. And also on top of all of that is that the main concept is that people do not change. This is obviously a huge deal for Old Testament versus New Testament because there's a constant call to change in the New Testament, which is, again, very different than the time period that the New Testament was written about. The New Testament was written about a time period where people did not change. Why didn't people change? People didn't change because they needed to fit in, because they needed to be part of the crowd, because they needed to be part of the family. Again, we're not talking about 2023 where you can go to Publix and grab some food, where you can go shop off the dollar menu when things are hard, where you can go to the soup kitchen or you can go to the food pantry when ends aren't being met. You can't do that then. If you weren't part of the family, if you weren't part of the group, if you weren't contributing, if you weren't giving something and getting something from the group, then you weren't part of the group and you would literally starve and die. You did not want to be different. You did not want to change. You did not want to go against the grain in this time for a number of reasons. But I would think that first and foremost, it was a matter of survival for these people. These people had so much pressure, so much pressure. The last thing they needed was a big change. And isn't it interesting that the last thing that they thought they needed was absolutely everything that they needed? If that doesn't preach, I don't know what will. Thank you so much for spending time with me today. That's all the context I have for the book of John. There's, I'm sure, more and more volumes. As the end of John says, more and more volumes could be written about this topic, but I'm not going to explore them all. But I do have some resources for you if you'd like to explore them. Thank you again so much for spending time with me. I look forward to going over the first subsection of John with you in the next video.